The Iranians have been very sophisticated, not only in developing a military doctrine and an offensive and defensive structure for themselves, but also in developing capabilities for their allies across the region. We have seen that sophistication very clearly during this war. When Iran launched drones and missiles, it did not simply fire them randomly. The attacks were designed to force the United States, its regional allies, and the Israeli regime to use as many interceptor missiles as possible. That is a very important part of modern warfare. You want your opponent to spend enormous amounts of money and exhaust critical military resources, while you use relatively inexpensive weapons and tactics to achieve your objectives. In this respect, I believe the Iranians have been far more sophisticated than their adversaries, both within the region and beyond it. Fundamental difference is that Iran developed its military capabilities according to the needs of the 21st century, while the Americans, the Israeli regime, and their regional proxies fought according to a 20th century military doctrine. You can see that difference very clearly in how the two sides positioned their military assets. American bases and other major assets across the region were largely out in the open. The same was true of many Israeli military assets. Iran did something very different. Its key military capabilities were placed deep underground. Its missile bases, drone facilities, factories, air defense systems, military aircraft, and command and control centers were protected underground. So the Americans and Israelis were attacking what they could see, while Iran had built much of what mattered where it was extremely difficult to reach. And this created a very different situation for the Americans and the Israeli regime. They could attack Iran, but attacking Iran did not mean that they could eliminate Iran's military capabilities. In fact, the Americans and the Israeli regime spent enormous quantities of interceptor missiles during the war. They were also firing missiles at underground missile cities. Even though many of those attacks produced very little effect, the Iranians understood that this was an opportunity. They used many thousands of decoys, and these decoys were extremely cheap compared with the missiles being used against them. The Americans and the Israeli regime would fire very expensive interceptors at targets that cost Iran very little. This is a fundamental principle of warfare. You want your opponent to spend vastly more resources trying to destroy your capabilities than you spend creating the targets they are attacking. Iran also used its older missiles and drones alongside more sophisticated systems. It was not necessary for every weapon to be technologically advanced. What mattered was how these different capabilities were combined and how they were used to overwhelm the enemy's defenses. So, while the United States and the Israeli regime were spending huge amounts of money and exhausting their missile stocks, Iran was preserving its most important capabilities underground and forcing the enemy to waste its resources. And this is why the difference between the two military doctrines matters so much. The Americans had enormous technological advantages, but Iran had designed its military structure around surviving precisely that kind of attack. The result is that many of the weapons fired at Iran had very little impact on the capabilities that Iran considered most important. At the same time, the Americans and their allies were rapidly consuming the resources they needed to maintain their own defenses. And this is why the Iranian approach has been so effective. Iran did not need to destroy every American or Israeli asset in the region. It needed to make the enemy's military strategy increasingly expensive and increasingly difficult to sustain. The use of decoys is a very good example. When you have a relatively inexpensive drone or missile that can force the enemy to fire a much more expensive interceptor, you are creating an enormous imbalance. The opponent may destroy the decoy, but he has still lost a valuable defensive weapon. The same principle applied to the larger Iranian missile attacks. Iran could use older missiles and drones while keeping many of its more important capabilities protected. At the same time, it could use more sophisticated methods to make the attacks more difficult to intercept. This meant that the United States and the Israeli regime were constantly facing a difficult choice. If they used their interceptors against every incoming target, they would rapidly consume their stocks. But if they did not, some of those missiles and drones could get through. And once you understand that, you can understand why the underground military infrastructure was so important. Iran was not simply hiding weapons underground. It was creating a military structure designed to continue functioning even when the country was under sustained attack. Its command and control centers were underground. Its missile bases were underground. Its drone facilities and factories were underground. Many of its other important military assets were protected in the same way. So even when the enemy could demonstrate its ability to strike Iran, it could not necessarily demonstrate the ability to eliminate Iran's capacity to continue fighting. That is the real difference between the two approaches. One side relied heavily on visible infrastructure and overwhelming firepower. The other built a system designed to absorb that firepower, preserve its core capabilities, and gradually exhaust the resources of its opponent. And the consequences of this are becoming clearer as the war continues. The Americans have not only used large numbers of their air defense missiles, they have also spent huge amounts of resources attacking targets that did not significantly reduce Iran's ability to continue fighting. That is the problem with a military doctrine built around destroying visible targets. If the opponent has already moved many of its critical capabilities underground, then destroying what you can see does not necessarily destroy what you need to destroy. Iran understood this when it developed its military structure. It knew that it could not simply place everything above ground and expect those assets to survive an American or Israeli attack. So it built a system that could continue operating even when the enemy had overwhelming air superiority. And then Iran added another layer to that strategy, forcing the enemy to waste its resources. Thousands of decoys could be used to draw fire from American and Israeli missile defenses. The cost of producing those decoys was relatively small, but the cost of intercepting them was enormous. The same was true when Iran combined older missiles and drones with more sophisticated methods of attack. So the question is not simply how many missiles Iran fired or how many targets the Americans and Israelis struck. The question is, who was exhausting their resources faster? From what we have seen, the Americans and the Israeli regime were consuming enormous quantities of interceptor missiles, while Iran was preserving important parts of its military structure. And that brings us to the situation today. Iran is more prepared for war now than it was 5 or 6 months ago. Its capabilities have been tested, its military has gained experience, and its core infrastructure remains available. Meanwhile, the Americans are facing serious problems. And while all of this is happening militarily, the global economy is moving closer and closer toward an economic crisis. And this is where I think we have to look at the broader consequences of what has happened. The important issue is not simply that Iran was able to launch missiles and drones. The important issue is that Iran designed its military capabilities in such a way that a much more powerful opponent could not easily eliminate them. The Americans and the Israeli regime had enormous technological advantages. They had advanced aircraft, sophisticated missiles, powerful intelligence systems, and large numbers of interceptor weapons. But all of those advantages become less decisive when the opponent has prepared for precisely that kind of warfare. Iran's strategy was based on endurance. Protect the important capabilities, keep the command structure functioning, use inexpensive decoys and weapons to force the enemy to expend extremely expensive resources, and then use more sophisticated attacks when necessary. So when I look at the situation today, I don't see an Iran that has been defeated militarily. I see an Iran that has learned from the war and is more prepared than it was 5 or 6 months ago. That is extremely important, because wars are also about learning. Every attack reveals information. Every missile launch reveals information. Every attempt to intercept those missiles reveals information. The side that learns and adapts can become more effective as the conflict continues. And that is what I believe we have seen from Iran. The Americans, meanwhile, have consumed enormous quantities of missiles and resources while trying to attack capabilities that were deliberately designed to survive. So the military problem is becoming an economic problem as well. And while the United States is dealing with these growing military pressures, the global economy is moving closer and closer toward a serious economic crisis. So in the end, this is not simply about which side has more missiles, more aircraft, or more advanced technology. It is about whether your military doctrine is suited to the war you are actually fighting. Iran prepared for a prolonged conflict by protecting its key capabilities, using inexpensive weapons and decoys, and forcing its adversaries to consume enormous resources. And that is why I believe the assumption that Iran could simply be overwhelmed through conventional air power has proven to be a very serious mistake. The longer this confrontation continues, the greater the costs become, not only militarily but economically. And that is the reality that the United States and its allies now have to confront.